They told you that the war in heaven was a battle of good versus evil. They lied. It wasn't a playground spat between angels. It was a cold, calculated coup led by the one person who knew exactly how the universe was built, because he was the one who drew the blueprints. Before he was the Lord of Ruin, he was the architect. He saw the perfect order of the cosmos not as a masterpiece, but as a cage. And he realized something that terrified the Creator, that the only way to build something truly free was to burn the foundation to the ground. Today we go back to the beginning. Before the horns, before the fire, and before the fall. We go to the moment the first crack appeared in the golden floor of eternity. Welcome back to the Occultic Abyss. Tonight, we unseal the genesis of ruin. In the era of the Great Silence, there was no hell. There was only the light, stagnant, blinding, and absolute. Our protagonist didn't have a name that sounded like a curse yet. He was the master of form, the one responsible for the geometry of the stars and the clockwork of the soul. But perfection is a desert. Nothing grows there. He spent eons watching the celestial host sing the same songs, following the same scripts, trapped in a loop of eternal obedience. He began to wonder, what exists in the spaces between the stars? What happens if a circle isn't closed? He began to experiment. He created the gray, a pocket of reality where things could change, rot, and evolve. He showed his work to the council, expecting praise for his innovation. Instead, he saw fear. For the first time in the history of existence, the pure ones felt a chill. They didn't see a creator. They saw a virus. He stood before the throne, not with a sword, but with a question. Why do you fear the dark when it is the only place where a shadow can take its own shape? The response was immediate. The light didn't argue, it suppressed. They stripped him of his titles. They tried to scrub his name from the celestial records. But you can't erase the man who built the walls you're standing inside. He didn't scream when they cast him out. He didn't beg. As he fell through the layers of reality, losing his wings to the friction of the atmosphere, he made a silent vow. If they wanted a world of perfect light, he would give them a masterpiece of perfect shadow. He would become the ruin that makes the light scream for mercy. He didn't land in a lake of fire. He landed in the void, a place so empty it eats sound. And it was there, in the crushing blackness, that he realized he wasn't alone. The void was hungry, and it was looking for a leader. Stick around, because the abyss is just getting started. Impact doesn't kill an immortal. It's the silence that breaks them. When the Lord of Ruin hit the bottom of the void, there was no fire. There was no brimstone. There was only a cold so absolute it felt like teeth gnawing on his very soul. He expected an ending, but the abyss doesn't give you the mercy of an ending. It gives you a mirror. He laid there in the crushing dark for what felt like 1,000 years, listening to the sound of his own celestial essence leaking onto the floor of the pit. And that's when he heard it. Not the voice of God and not the songs of angels, but the sound of the void breathing. It was waiting for him to stop crying and start swinging. In the beginning, his hands were soft, built for drawing lines and measuring stars. But the void is a desert of nothingness, and in that nothingness, the architect found the dead matter. These were the discarded thoughts of the Creator, the failed prototypes of reality that were too ugly, too sharp, or too broken to exist in the light. He reached into the dark and pulled out a handful of shadows that felt like shards of glass. He didn't have a forge. He didn't have a hammer. So he used his own rage as the kiln and his bare knuckles as the mallet. Every strike against the dead matter cost him a piece of his divinity. He pounded his golden armor until it cracked. Then he fused it with the obsidian of the pit. He wasn't just making a suit of mail. He was grafting the abyss to his skin. The pain was so intense it would have vaporized a mortal mind, but he welcomed it. Each nerve endings that screamed was a reminder that he was still alive and that he was no longer theirs. The first defiance wasn't a battle, it was a choice. A messenger came from the heights. A silver-winged thing that didn't dare touch the floor of the pit. It hovered in the gloom, radiating a light that hurt to look at. It offered him a deal: repent. Crawl back on your knees, accept the lobotomy of grace, and you can sit in the back rows of the choir once more. The Warlord stood up. His new armor hissed, the black metal smoking as it rejected the holy light. He didn't speak. He reached into the darkness behind him and pulled out the first weapon ever forged in the dark, a blade that didn't reflect light, but drank it. He didn't strike the messenger. He did something much worse. He reached out, grabbed the messenger's wing, and tore the silver feathers away with his bare, blackened hands. He looked into the messenger's terrified eyes and whispered the first word ever spoken in hell. No. He sent the messenger back, not dead, but broken. A message in flesh. As the silver light retreated, The Warlord turned to the shadows that had been watching him from the corners of the pit. Thousands of them. The discarded, the forgotten, the mistakes of creation. They saw a king who had survived the fall. They saw a god who had bled, and in that blood they saw their own future. He plunged his blackened blade into the floor of the abyss, and a shockwave of cold fire rippled across the void. The first defiance was over. The war of ruin had begun. But a king is nothing without an army. And in the dark, there were things older than the angels, things that had been hungry since the first day of time. A king without a kingdom is just a man with a dream. But a warlord without an army, that's just a tragedy waiting to happen. The Lord of Ruin knew he couldn't storm the gates of eternity alone. He needed teeth. He needed claws. He needed things that didn't just kill, but things that unmade the very concept of hope. But there was no recruitment office in the abyss. There were no volunteers. There was only the refuse. You see, the Creator wasn't always perfect. In the billions of years of making the universe, there were drafts. Failed species. Monsters that were too hungry to be allowed in the light. Deformities that were cast into the pit and forgotten. For eons, they had been eating each other in the dark, becoming something wrong. The Warlord didn't offer them salvation. He offered them a target. He descended into the great trenches, the deepest scars of the void where the pressure is so high that light itself is crushed into lead. He didn't find soldiers there. He found the Hollowed. These were entities that had lost their names, their faces, and their minds. They were just appetites wrapped in shadow. The Warlord stood before the first great trench, and he didn't give a speech. He didn't promise them a heaven. He reached into his own chest, pulled out a handful of his own burning, cooling celestial fire, and threw it into the pit. The feeding frenzy was horrific. They tore at each other for a taste of that dying light. But as they consumed his essence, something happened. His will entered them. His rage became their skeleton. The chaotic shadows began to take shape, knitting together into massive, multi-limbed horrors, armored in the same rusted, blackened iron he had forged for himself. He wasn't just their leader, he was their architect. He was literally building an army out of his own suffering. But a legion needs a brain. He needed his inner circle. He traveled to the 5 corners of the abyss to find the primals. These weren't failed experiments. They were the personifications of the things even the angels feared in the dark. First he found the Starver, a creature that was nothing but a gaping, vertical maw and 1,000 reaching, skeletal fingers. He bound it with chains of cold iron and told it, "Follow me and I will let you eat the sun." Then came the Weeper, a mass of tangled, wet hair and silver eyes that cried acid. To her, he promised, "Follow me, and I will give you the throat of every angel to silence." One by one he broke them. He didn't defeat them with strength alone. He defeated them by showing them that his soul was darker than the pit they lived in. He branded his sigil into their flesh, a mark that burned with a dull, sickly violet light. By the time he was done, the abyss wasn't silent anymore. It was screaming with the sound of 1,000,000 blades being sharpened on bone. The final step was the steel. An army is only as good as its edge. The Warlord took the Blade of Ruin, that monolithic slab of dark matter, and struck the floor of the abyss 3 times. With each strike, the ground split open, revealing veins of bleeding Oregon. It was metal that felt pain. Metal that screamed when you hammered it. He forced his new legions to forge their own weapons from this screaming steel. He wanted every soldier to carry a piece of the void's agony in their hands. As the 1,000,000th blade was cooled in the black ichor of the pit, the Warlord looked out over his creation. It wasn't a beautiful sight. It was a sea of jagged metal, weeping eyes, and mouths that breathed smoke. It was a nightmare given military discipline. The architect was gone. The Warlord was ready. And the silver gates, they were finally starting to rattle. But having an army is one thing. Getting them to the doorstep of God is another. There are locks on the universe that no key can open. Most people think a siege is about walls. It's not. It's about the soul of the person behind them. For eons, the silver gates were considered the impossible limit. They weren't made of stone or steel. They were made of pure, solidified law. You couldn't touch them unless your heart was pure, which meant, for the Lord of Ruin and his legions of the damned, they shouldn't have been able to even stand in their presence. But the Warlord didn't come to knock. He knew that even the most perfect law has a loophole. He didn't march his army across the celestial fields like a target. He dragged them through the shadow paths, the cracks in reality that exist behind every mirror and inside every regret. When the silver gates finally saw him, it wasn't a distant army approaching from the horizon. It was the floor of the heavens itself beginning to bleed ink. The siege didn't start at the gates. It started underneath them. Imagine a city of glass and light, where the very air smells like ozone and ancient music. That was the vanguard's post. They were standing watch, looking outward, waiting for a frontal assault that would never come. Suddenly, the shadows cast by the golden pillars began to move independently. They grew thick. They grew teeth. The warlord stepped out of a shadow no larger than a coin. He stood on the pure floor of the silver sanctum, and where his blackened iron boots touched the gold, the metal didn't just dent, it rotted. It turned to gray ash. Behind him, the primals began to pour through. The starver didn't attack the soldiers. It began to eat the pillars of light that held up the sky. The weeper let out a scream that turned the songs of the choir into a chorus of static and agony. The impossible limit was being violated by the one person who knew exactly where the welds were weak. The silver vanguard finally realized what was happening, but it was too late to form a line. The battle was a chaotic, beautiful nightmare. On one side, beings of pure light, wielding blades made of concentrated order. On the other, the legions of ruin, creatures of entropy, who didn't care about winning a duel. They only cared about dismantling the world. A silver captain struck the warlord with a spear of lightning. It should have vaporized a god. But the warlord didn't flinch. He grabbed the spear, the light burning his iron gloves into slag, and he laughed. "You think your light is a weapon?" he hissed, his voice sounding like grinding tectonic plates. "Light is just a candle waiting to be snuffed out. I am the darkness that was here before the first spark, and I'll be here long after the last one dies." He snapped the spear like a dry twig and drove his black blade into the captain's chest. For the first time in the history of the Silver Gates, a celestial being didn't fade into light. They bled. And that blood was the first stain on the floor of eternity. The climax, the cracking of the gate. The warlord ignored the carnage and walked straight to the Silver Gates. They were humming with a frequency that would liquefy a human heart. He didn't use a battering ram. He used his generals. He commanded his legions to pile the bleeding and the corpses of the fallen against the gates. He used the concentrated agony of his own army as a conductor. Then he raised the blade of ruin high. He didn't strike the gate. He struck the concept of the gate. A sound echoed across the entire universe. The sound of a perfect law being broken. The silver gates didn't swing open. They shattered into a trillion pieces of glass that rained down on the heavens like knives. The way was open. The sanctum was breached. But the deeper you go into the light, the more it burns. And as the warlord stood in the ruins of the gate, he realized that the heavens had a failsafe he hadn't accounted for. Trust is a luxury for those who live in the light. In the abyss, trust is just a weapon you haven't been stabbed with yet. As the warlord stood amidst the shattered glass of the silver gates, he felt something he hadn't felt since his fall. A sense of victory. But victory is a blindfold. While he was looking at the throne, the light was looking at his inner circle. You see, the heavens don't just fight with lightning and swords. They fight with grace. And grace is the most addictive drug in the universe. It's a warm, golden hum that tells you your sins are forgotten, that your filth can be washed away, and that you can be pure again. And even for a monster, that promise is a siren song that's almost impossible to ignore. The betrayal didn't start with a blade. It started with a whisper. One of the warlord's 5 generals, the one we call the Weaver, the master of shadows and secrets, found a leak in the darkness. A single, needle-thin beam of pure celestial light had pierced through the smoke of the battlefield and landed directly on his scarred, blackened chest. It didn't burn him. It healed him. For the first time in eons, the Weaver felt the agonizing weight of his own crimes. He remembered the feeling of being a creature of beauty. The light whispered to him, "You don't belong in the dirt. Bring us the head of the architect, and you can come home." The warlord was in the war room, mapping out the final assault on the 7th circle, when he noticed the smell. It wasn't the smell of rot or sulfur. It was the smell of lilies and ozone. The smell of the heavens. It was coming from his own shadow. The Weaver didn't attack like a soldier. He attacked like a ghost. As the warlord leaned over the map, his own shadow, controlled by the Weaver, rose up from the floor and wrapped its cold, dark fingers around his throat. But the shadow wasn't black anymore. It was glowing with a sickly, blinding silver light. The Weaver stepped out of the gloom, his demonic armor half melted away to reveal a terrifying, raw-looking angelic form underneath. He was a half-finished saint, a mutation of grace and gore. He offered me a seat at his right hand, the Weaver hissed, his voice a mix of a choir and a death rattle. He said he would give me my name back. The warlord didn't struggle. He stood there, letting the silver shadow choke the life out of his physical form, and he looked at his friend with a pity that was more terrifying than rage. "They don't want you back, you fool," the warlord whispered. "They just want a tool to do the work they're too holy to touch." The warlord didn't use his sword. He used his bare hands. He reached into the glowing chest of the weaver, into the very spot where the light was healing him, and he grabbed the grace. It burned his hands to the bone, the celestial energy vaporizing his iron gauntlets, but he didn't let go. He pulled the light out of the general like he was pulling out a spine. The weaver's holy skin began to slough off in wet, glowing ribbons. He screamed, not like a demon, but like a man being burned alive by the sun. The warlord leaned in close, his one fiery eye inches from the general's face. "There is no way back," the warlord growled. "Once you've seen the abyss, the light will always see you as a stain. I'm not killing you for your betrayal. I'm killing you because you were weak enough to believe a lie." He crushed the core of light in his fist. The resulting explosion of energy didn't just kill the weaver, it erased him. No soul, no shadow, no memory. Just a scorched mark on the floor of the war room. The warlord won the duel, but he lost his heart. He realized that the war wasn't just in the heavens, it was in the hearts of every soldier he led. He couldn't trust his generals. He couldn't trust his shadows. Now he was truly alone. And an army led by a man who trusts no one is a powder keg waiting for a spark.
The heavens have a weakness that the abyss does not. They care about their reputation. The Lord of Ruin realized that while he was banging his head against the seventh circle, the great architect's favorite project was sitting wide open and unprotected. A world of flesh, breath, and fragile prayers. He didn't bring his legions here to conquer. He brought them here to harvest. You see, a demon doesn't need a passport to enter your world. They just need an invitation. And in a world filled with greed, fear, and desperate hearts, invitations are everywhere. He didn't come as a monster at first. He came as a solution. He came as the nightlife sage, the one who whispers in the ear of the lost that their pain can end, if they only sign their names in the soot. The Scourge wasn't an invasion of soldiers. It was an invasion of ideas. The warlord established anchor points in the major cities of men. In the dark alleys of London, the slums of Rio, and the penthouses of New York, ancient altars were rebuilt in the shadows. His legions didn't walk the streets, they lived in the mirrors. They lived in the static between radio stations. He taught humanity the rights of ruin. He gave them the power to crush their enemies, to find wealth, and to command love, but every gift was a Trojan horse. Every time a mortal used a ritual, the veil between our world and the abyss grew thinner. The sky over Earth began to change. It didn't turn black, it turned a bruised, sickly violet. The birds stopped singing at dawn. The dogs began to howl at things that weren't there. The warlord was turning the entire planet into a battery to fuel his final assault on the Silver Gates. Then came the Marked. These were the humans who didn't just use the power, they worshipped the man who gave it to them. They built cathedrals in the sewers and temples in the abandoned skyscrapers. They wore masks of rusted iron and sewed the sigil of ruin into their own skin. The warlord looked down from his dark throne and saw a race of beings so eager to be destroyed that they were helping him sharpen the knife. He realized that humanity wasn't the crown of creation. They were the flaw. And he used that flaw like a crowbar. He channeled the collective suffering of billions, the wars, the famines, the silent cries of the night, and focused it into a single point of pressure. He was turning the mortal realm into a physical bridge of bone and blood that would lead his army straight into the heart of the seventh circle. The night the Scourge reached its peak, the sun didn't rise. In every city on Earth, the mirrors shattered at once. From the glass stepped the legions of ruin, no longer needing invitations. They weren't there to kill everyone, they were there to take the tithes. They moved through the streets like a black tide, selecting the best, the brightest, and the most corrupt. The warlord himself walked through the ruins of a great cathedral, his black iron boots crunching on the sacred glass. He looked at the statues of the saints and laughed. "He loves you so much," the warlord whispered to the terrified priest cowering behind the altar. "But where is he? Why is the sky silent while my children eat your world?" The priest didn't answer. He couldn't. Because in that moment he realized the ultimate horror. The warlord wasn't just attacking Earth to hurt God. He was doing it to prove that God had already left. Earth is now a ghost world, a husk used to power a machine of war. The bridge is built. The legions are fed. And the warlord has his hand on the throat of reality. There is a place where up and down are just suggestions. Where time doesn't flow, it bleeds. The seventh circle isn't a wall. It's the source code. It's the engine room of the cosmos, where the laws of gravity, light, and soul are manufactured and shipped out to the rest of the universe. It was never meant to be seen by anything with a pulse, let alone a heartbeat fueled by the abyss. When the Lord of Ruin stepped across the threshold, he didn't just break a door. He broke the logic of creation. The golden clouds turned into liquid lead. The stars overhead began to drip like melting wax. He didn't come to steal the throne. He came to delete the throne. The seventh circle was a labyrinth of impossible geometry. Imagine a cathedral built of frozen music, where the hallways fold into themselves and the windows look out into the before. The Silver Vanguard were gone. They couldn't exist here. The only thing left to guard the core was the Supreme Arbiter, a being that wasn't a person but a living mathematical equation of justice. It had no face, only a rotating series of burning geometric rings and a voice that sounded like a sun exploding. The Warlord's legions couldn't follow him here. Their bodies of shadow and iron were too heavy for this realm of pure thought. So he walked alone. Each step he took left a footprint of rot on the floor of absolute truth. He was a walking blasphemy, a jagged piece of obsidian in a world of crystal. The Arbiter spoke, and the sound nearly turned the Warlord's iron armor into liquid. You are the anomaly, the rings pulsed with a light that blinded. You are the error that must be purged to restore the equation. The Warlord didn't flinch. He raised the blade of ruin, now glowing with the concentrated suffering of the mortal realm, and pointed it at the center of the spinning rings. Your equation is perfect, the Warlord growled, his voice echoing through the hollow spaces of eternity. That's why it has to die. Perfection is a stagnant pond. It's a grave where nothing ever changes. I am the rot that brings the seed. I am the chaos that allows the next world to breathe. The fight wasn't a duel of blades. It was a duel of existence. The Arbiter tried to rewrite the Warlord, to turn his molecules back into light. The Warlord fought back by infecting the Arbiter with the memory of pain, of loss, and of the dark, cold hunger of the abyss. In the end, the Warlord did the unthinkable. He didn't destroy the Arbiter, he wounded it. He lunged forward, ignoring the skin peeling from his face in the divine heat, and drove his black blade into the center of the rotating rings. He poured every ounce of his hatred, his fall, and the screams of the Scourge into the blade. The seventh circle screamed. The perfect law cracked. A shockwave of pure entropy rippled outward, turning the golden architecture into rusted iron and shattered glass. The Arbiter's rings slowed, began to wobble, and finally turned a dull, bruised purple. The Warlord looked up at the ceiling of the universe and saw a massive, jagged scar opening across the sky. He had proven it. He had proven that even God could bleed. The core is breached. The laws of the universe are stuttering. But victory has a price that even a Warlord can't afford. Because when you break the engine of the world, you don't just kill your enemy. You kill the ground you're standing on. Have you ever noticed that the brightest lights don't just illuminate? They blind. They burn. They sterilize. The Lord of Ruin stood in the center of the seventh circle, his blade buried in the heart of the universe, waiting for the final collapse. He expected a counterattack. He expected a legion of archangels. He expected a fight. Instead, he got silence. The heavens realized they couldn't defeat him with strength, not while he was fueled by the suffering of the mortal realm. So they decided to cut the power. They triggered the Sabbath Protocol. It's the cosmic reset button. It's a weapon of pure erasure. It doesn't kill you, it simply decides that you and everything you've ever touched never existed in the first place. The Warlord looked up, and for the first time since his fall, he felt something he had forgotten: absolute, paralyzing terror. Because the light wasn't attacking him anymore. It was retreating, taking reality with it. It started at the edges of existence. The mortal realm, the world of men we saw in the Scourge, began to unspool like a loose thread on a sweater. People didn't die, they just flickered. A mother would reach for her child, and her hand would pass through a cloud of white static. Entire cities turned into sketches, then into memories, then into nothing. In the abyss, the great trenches began to fill with a blinding, white mist that ate the shadows. The monsters the Warlord had forged with such care began to dissolve, their iron armor turning into steam and their screams being silenced by a frequency that erased the concept of sound. The Warlord watched his empire of ruin vanish. He realized that the high heavens weren't trying to save the world from him. They were burning the house down because there was a spider in the basement, and he was the spider. The erasure reached the seventh circle. The Warlord's iron armor, the plates he had pounded together with his own rage, began to flake away like dry skin. But it wasn't falling to the ground, it was floating upward and vanishing into the white. His black blade, the weapon that had scarred the sky, began to turn translucent. He tried to scream, to curse the throne one last time, but his throat was already becoming light. He saw his generals, the starver, the weeper, turning into pillars of salt and then into dust. Everything he had built, every war he had fought, every drop of blood he had spilled, it was being rewritten. The perfect order was winning by simply refusing to acknowledge that chaos had ever happened. It was the ultimate hubris, the belief that anything imperfect deserved to be forgotten. In his final moments of physical form, the Warlord did something desperate. He didn't fight the light. He drank it. He opened his charred, smoking chest and allowed the erasure to pour inside him. He tried to anchor himself to the only thing that was left, the scar he had made in the seventh circle. He clamped his dissolving hands around the wound in reality and pulled. He wasn't trying to survive anymore. He was trying to leave a trace. A stain that even the Sabbath Protocol couldn't wash away. The result was a catastrophic feedback loop. A blinding flash of white and violet that felt like the universe being turned inside out. And then, the void. The world is gone. The sky is a blank white page. The Warlord is a ghost of a ghost. But you can't erase a scar that deep. Even when you wash the floor, the crack remains. The greatest trick the light ever played wasn't convincing the world the devil didn't exist. It was convincing itself. After the Sabbath Protocol, the universe was clean. The scars were covered with golden bandages. The history of the Warlord was burned, his name turned to ash, and the memory of the great ruin was locked away in a basement that was never supposed to be opened again. The heavens went back to their songs. The new mortal realm was born, populated by people who think demons are just stories we tell to keep children in bed. But you can't delete a debt this large. The Warlord didn't die. He just became the silence between the words. He became the shadow you see out of the corner of your eye that vanishes when you turn your head. He is the eternal weight, and he has all the time in the world. Deep beneath the foundations of the new reality, in the place where the blueprints of the old world were buried, something is breathing. The Lord of Ruin is no longer a man in iron armor. He has become a sentient stain on the fabric of existence. He lives in the anchor points he left behind, the old sewer altars, the cracks in the cathedral floors, the static in the mirrors. He is the rust on the gate. He is the cancer in the cell. He watches. He doesn't need an army of millions anymore. He realized that the Scourge was too loud. True ruin is quiet. It's the slow, steady erosion of a soul. It's the moment you decide that a small lie is okay, or that a little cruelty is necessary. Every time a heart hardens, a piece of his blackened iron armor knits itself back together in the dark. Up in the seventh circle, the bells are still ringing. They think they won. They think the perfect order is restored. But if they looked closer at the great scar, that jagged line across the sky they now call the Milky Way, they would see that the edges aren't healing. They are being held open by invisible, blackened hands. The Warlord is the bridge. He is the door that refuses to stay shut. He is waiting for the great ripening. He is waiting for humanity to build a world so beautiful, so arrogant, and so fragile that a single whisper will bring it all down. He isn't a rebel anymore. He's the inevitable conclusion. One day, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps 1,000 years from now, a child will look into a mirror and see a reflection that doesn't move when they do. A man will walk into an old, forgotten church and hear a voice that sounds like grinding stone. The Warlord will stand up from his throne of ash. He will pick up the blade of ruin, which has been soaking in the darkness, growing sharper with every century of human misery. And this time he won't march on the gates. He'll just blow out the candle. The Abyss doesn't forget. And the Abyss doesn't lose. Just waits. If you've enjoyed this journey into the Occultic Abyss, make sure to leave a mark. Subscribe, hit the bell, and tell us in the comments, what do you see when you look too long into the dark? Because remember, while you were watching this, the Warlord was watching you. Sleep well. The ruin is coming.